My brother disappeared when I was 26 years old. One morning he was there, and by that evening his bedroom was empty, his phone was disconnected, and the only thing left was a note on the kitchen counter that said he needed space. That was 12 years ago. My father spent the first 3 years filing missing persons reports that went nowhere, calling hospitals in 4 states, and driving routes my brother used to take just looking. My mother lit candles at church every Sunday for a decade. I kept his number saved in my phone long after the carrier recycled it, because deleting it felt like giving up on something I couldn't name. Then our father died, and Daniel walked through the door of the funeral home like he'd only been gone a weekend. I need you to understand something before I go any further. The people in that room have very strong opinions about what happened next, and about what I did, and about whether I went too far. Some of them still think I should have stayed quiet. Some of them think the chaplain should have stayed quiet. But not one person, not a single person in that family, has called me a liar. And after everything you are about to hear, I want you to decide for yourself what you would have done. Let me take you back to before any of this happened, because the day Daniel came back wasn't the beginning of the story. It was just the day everything that had been building for 12 years finally had nowhere left to go. My name is Nora Scott, and I am the middle child of three. My older sister is Claudia Ferreira, married name Claudia Harmon, who has a talent for making every room feel like a performance she is starring in. My brother Daniel Ferreira is 4 years younger than me and was always, from the time he was old enough to talk, my father's favorite in a way nobody said out loud, but everybody understood. My father, Eduardo Ferreira, was a civil engineer who built his career on precision and built his family on a hierarchy that was just as precise, even if he would have denied it to his last breath. My mother, Rosa Ferreira, is still alive. She was at the funeral. She was at the reading of the will. She was at every dinner where something went wrong and every holiday where something went sideways, standing in her kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, absorbing everything and saying very little. I used to think that was weakness. I understand it differently now. I grew up in a house in Sacramento where achievement was measured and compared openly. Claudia got straight A's and my parents framed her report cards. Daniel struggled in school but had a mechanical gift that made my father beam, and so his C's were called potential and his absences were called independence. I was somewhere in the middle, which in that house meant I was invisible in the way furniture is invisible. Present, functional, and unremarkable. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had a real estate license, a small client base I'd built through sheer persistence, and a reputation in my brokerage that was beginning to mean something. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Elk Grove. My car was a 4-year-old Honda Accord that I maintained religiously because I couldn't afford surprises. I had almost no savings and a lot of ambition, which is a combination that either destroys you or sharpens you into something you didn't expect. My family's understanding of my situation was approximately 0% accurate. At a Thanksgiving dinner in the year after I got my license, Claudia told me, in front of my parents and her husband Glenn, that I should consider something more stable. She said real estate was a feast or famine career, and that I didn't have the kind of network that made it sustainable long term. She said this while refilling her wine glass, the way people deliver judgments they've been rehearsing in the shower. What she didn't know was that 3 days earlier I had closed my first commercial property, a small office building in Rancho Cordova that earned me a commission of $44,000. I didn't correct her. I helped clear the table and drove home and opened my laptop and transferred the maximum allowed amount into a Roth IRA I had opened the previous month. That was the first time I understood that being underestimated wasn't a problem. It was a resource. The pattern after that was consistent. My parents called every few weeks, and the conversation always drifted toward what I should be doing differently. Had I considered getting back into school? Was I sure I didn't want to look into something with benefits? My mother once mailed me a printout of a job posting for a county assessor's office, with a note that said the benefits package looked very solid. That was in the spring, 2 years after I'd closed my second $1 million residential listing and was beginning to build what would eventually become a respectable portfolio of investment properties. I kept the printout. I don't know why. Sometimes I think I kept it as a reminder of what the ceiling looked like from where they were standing. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what it feels like to sit at a table and smile while building something they can't see yet. Daniel's disappearance happened the summer I turned 26. It landed on the family like a weight that never fully lifted. My parents' grief was real, and I don't minimize it. But the family dynamics didn't pause for mourning. Claudia stepped into a role she'd been quietly auditioning for, the responsible one, the present one, the one who showed up. She and Glenn started coming to dinner every Sunday. She became the clearinghouse for family information. If you wanted to know what was happening with my parents, you called Claudia first. I understood what was happening and I let it happen, because I was busy building something, and Sunday dinners in Sacramento were not where my focus needed to be. 3 years after Daniel disappeared, I bought my first investment property. It was a duplex in Stockton that I found through a foreclosure listing and negotiated down to $230,000. I financed it with a combination of savings, a loan from my brokerage owner that I paid back in 14 months, and a level of personal austerity that I would not repeat. I rented both units within 6 weeks. I kept that property quiet, not out of shame, out of strategy. I had watched my family's reaction to success my whole life, and what I had observed was this. They responded to other people's success by finding reasons it wasn't real, wouldn't last, or didn't count. Claudia's husband Glenn had an MBA from a state school and managed regional accounts for a packaging distributor. When he got a promotion, my father spent a Sunday dinner talking about the packaging industry's long-term vulnerabilities. When I eventually closed a property deal that made local business news, the same father who had once said real estate was unstable for someone like me suddenly couldn't remember ever having doubts. I didn't want that dynamic anywhere near what I was building. So I kept it separate. By the time my father was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, roughly 4 years before the funeral where Daniel appeared, I had a real estate portfolio that included 4 residential investment properties and 1 small commercial unit. I had a business account that had cleared 7 figures in total transaction volume. I had retained an estate attorney named Victor Caldwell in November of the year before my father's diagnosis. Not because I expected an inheritance worth fighting over, but because I had built something worth protecting, and I had learned the hard way that verbal understandings are worth exactly what they cost. Victor had helped me structure my property holdings through a limited liability company and had advised me to document everything. I met with him quarterly, and he knew my situation better than anyone in my family did. I also had a financial advisor, a woman named Sylvia Ackefer at a wealth management firm in Sacramento, who had been helping me build a diversified portfolio alongside my real estate holdings. She was direct, occasionally blunt, and had exactly once told me that my risk tolerance was healthier than most of her clients, and exactly twice told me I needed to stop letting sentimentality cloud my assessment of a property's value. I trusted her completely. My daughter Lily was 7 years old at the time of my father's funeral. Her father and I had separated when she was 2. The split was not dramatic, just 2 people who had grown into shapes that no longer fit the same space. We co-parented reasonably well, and she spent alternating weeks with each of us. She was enrolled in a program at her school for academically advanced students that she loved, and she had been seeing a pediatric speech therapist named Dr. Amara Singh twice a month since she was 4, because of a processing delay that was mild and manageable and something we caught early. She was covered on my health insurance plan through my LLC, and Dr. Singh's sessions were covered at 80%. I had also established a college savings account for Lily the year she was born through a financial plan Sylvia managed, and I added to it every quarter. By the time of my father's funeral, it had grown to just under $65,000. I mention this because it becomes relevant later in a way I could not have anticipated. My father's condition worsened in the last year of his life. I drove up to Sacramento every 2 to 3 weeks. I helped coordinate care schedules with my mother. I paid for a home health aide for 6 months out of pocket without telling anyone in the family, because the alternative was waiting for Claudia to organize something through committee, and my father didn't have time for committee. My mother knew. She didn't tell Claudia. I don't know whether that was loyalty or avoidance, but it didn't matter. What I did not know during any of those drives to Sacramento, during any of those dinners where my mother held everything together with dish towels and silence, during any of the months where Claudia managed logistics and Glenn nodded along, and my father drifted toward sleep earlier and earlier each evening, was where Daniel was. Nobody knew, that's what we thought. I need to stay on this point because it matters to everything that happened afterward. Nobody knew, that was the story. That was the story my mother told and my father believed and Claudia repeated, and I had no reason to question. Daniel had left. Daniel had chosen to disappear. For 12 years, that was the understanding. He was somewhere, alive presumably, and he had chosen not to be with us. My father grieved this alongside his illness in a way that combined them into one long exhaustion. He mentioned Daniel's name less and less toward the end, and when he did it was with a particular kind of resigned sadness that I didn't have words for then and don't have better words for now. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, at home, with my mother beside him and the home health aide in the kitchen and me on the highway 40 minutes away when my phone rang. I had been at a property inspection in Modesto the evening before and had planned to go straight to Sacramento in the morning. I was 40 minutes away when he died. I have made my peace with that mostly, because peace is the only option available. The funeral was 3 days later, at a Catholic church in Sacramento that my parents had attended since before I was born. The reception afterward was at the funeral home, a long, narrow room with folding tables covered in white tablecloths and photographs of my father arranged on a display board near the entrance. About 60 people came. Extended family, neighbors, men my father had worked with for 30 years, the priest. I was standing near the photograph display, talking to one of my father's former colleagues, when the door at the far end of the room opened. And there was Daniel. He was wearing a dark suit that didn't quite fit, the jacket too wide in the shoulders, like something borrowed. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair was shorter and had gray in it that hadn't been there 12 years ago, which made sense. We were all 12 years older, but it was still a shock. The physical evidence of time passing on a face I had last seen when we were both young. He stood in the doorway and didn't move, and the room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, starting near the door and spreading back toward where I was standing, like a sound moving through water. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a word, just a sound. Claudia grabbed Glenn's arm. I stood very still and looked at my brother, whom I had not seen in 12 years, standing in the doorway of our father's funeral, and I felt something I genuinely cannot describe precisely. Not joy, not anger, something older than both of those things. I want to tell you what the chaplain told me because that's what this story is actually about, but I need you to understand the room first. I need you to understand what it meant that Daniel was standing there, what it meant that my mother was making that sound, what it meant that 60 people were watching my family try to absorb something no one had prepared for. Because when Chaplain Father Bernard Oak pulled me aside, very quietly, very deliberately, and told me what he knew about where my brother had been, everything I thought I understood about the last 12 years shifted underneath me. And then, before I could process a single word of it, the door opened again. And the police arrived. I had exactly one coherent thought in that moment, standing in a funeral home reception room with my father's photographs behind me and my brother 10 feet in front of me and two uniformed officers walking through the door. I thought, I need to call Victor. I'll explain why in a moment. But first, let me take you back to the 18 months before that day, because that's when I started building the thing that would matter. I had started visiting Victor Caldwell more frequently after my father's diagnosis, not for inheritance planning, because I had no illusions about what my parents' estate amounted to. My father had a pension, a modest life insurance policy, and the family home in Sacramento that my mother would almost certainly continue living in. I visited Victor because I was restructuring how my properties were held, consolidating two of the residential units under a different ownership structure, and updating my own estate documents to ensure that if something happened to me, Lily's college fund and the property holdings would pass cleanly to a trust Sylvia and Victor had helped me establish. Victor had reviewed everything in a meeting I attended on a Thursday afternoon in November, 2 years before the funeral. I remember the date because it was the week my father's cardiologist had adjusted his medication and things had felt suddenly more serious. Victor had said, at the end of that meeting, something that stayed with me. He said the most common source of family conflict in estate matters wasn't greed, it was surprise. People who had been excluded from information felt blindsided, and blindsided people made terrible decisions and filed unnecessary claims and turned grief into litigation. He said documentation was the only reliable insulation against surprise. I had nodded and taken notes and driven home thinking about my father, not about Daniel, because at that point, Daniel was just the absence in our family that we had all made our adjustments around. I think about that conversation now with a particular kind of clarity. The 18 months before my father's death were, professionally, the most significant of my career to that point. I had been approached by a developer named Frank Yu about a partnership on a mixed-use development project in the Midtown Sacramento corridor. It was a scale of project I had never touched before. The numbers required were significant. The risk was real. Frank was meticulous and well-capitalized and had done two similar projects in the East Bay that I had researched thoroughly before agreeing to take the first meeting. I brought Sylvia into the conversation early. I had 3 conversations with Victor about the entity structure. I took 4 months to review projections and ask questions before I committed. I committed in late January, 14 months before my father's funeral. The partnership agreement was finalized after 6 weeks of drafts and revisions, and one very long phone call, where I pushed back on an indemnification clause that Frank's attorney had buried in the language, and Frank's attorney had tried to wave away as standard, and Victor had very calmly explained was not standard and was not going to remain in the document. It didn't remain in the document. I signed in mid-March. My share of the initial capital outlay was $280,000, drawn from a combination of a refinancing of my commercial unit and a portion of my investment account that Sylvia had structured for exactly this kind of liquidity event. It was the largest single financial commitment of my life, and I lost sleep over it for 3 weeks and then stopped, because the numbers were sound, and I had done the work and sleep deprivation was not part of the business plan. Nobody in my family knew any of this. Not Claudia, not my mother, not anyone. What my family knew about my professional life at that point was approximately what they had always known, which was that I was in real estate, which they understood to mean I showed houses to people on weekends. Claudia had once asked me, a few years earlier, whether I had looked into getting my broker's license so I could at least collect desk fees from other agents. I had my broker's license. I had held it for 4 years. I collected desk fees from 3 agents who worked under me. I thanked her for the suggestion. There were 2 moments in the 14 months between signing with Frank and the day of my father's funeral when I came very close to having to explain more than I wanted to. The first was at Christmas, 8 months before the funeral. My mother had asked Claudia to coordinate the holiday, which meant Claudia sent everyone a schedule and a list of what to bring and a reminder about her mother-in-law's nut allergy. Glenn's parents came, which they did every other year, and the house was full in the way that full houses are during Christmas, every surface occupied, every conversation slightly too loud. At some point in the late afternoon, Glenn cornered me in the hallway near the kitchen. Glenn was the kind of man who asked questions that were meant to establish his authority in the subject rather than gather information. He asked me how the market was treating me, the way you ask someone how their hobby is going. I told him it was active. He said he'd read that inventory was tight and that things were cooling off and that it might be a harder year for people in residential sales. I told him that was largely accurate for that segment, yes. He tilted his head. You're doing okay, though. I mean financially, because if things get thin, there's no shame in supplementing with property management. Claudia's cousin does that on the side and it covers his expenses. I looked at him for a moment. He had a glass of eggnog in one hand and the casual confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own assessment of a situation. I appreciate that, I said. I'm in good shape. Good, good, he nodded. Just wanted to make sure. You know, solo operators in real estate, the swings can be brutal. They can be, I agreed. He patted my arm and went back to the living room. I stood in the hallway for approximately 4 seconds and then went to find my daughter, who was in the corner of the living room with her cousin, attempting to teach the family dog, a trick that the dog was showing no interest in learning. Lily looked up at me with a gap-toothed grin and said, "Mom, watch," and the dog looked at neither of us. And I stood there watching my kid and feeling something steady inside myself that all of Glenn's eggnog-fueled financial concern could not touch. That was the second time I understood that invisibility was not the same as weakness. The second close call came 4 months before the funeral in November. I was at my mother's house helping her sort through some of my father's papers, which had become necessary as his condition made him less able to manage his own affairs. My mother had asked me to help organize the filing cabinet in the study, which was less a filing cabinet and more a physical archive of everything my father had considered important since approximately 1987. Tax returns, warranties for appliances that had been replaced twice over. A folder labeled simply "Family" that contained birth certificates and my parents' marriage certificate, and a life insurance policy document with a yellow sticky note on the front in my father's handwriting. I was going through a separate drawer when Claudia arrived. She hadn't called ahead, which was typical. She came in through the front, called out to our mother, dropped her coat on the chair in the entryway, and came directly to the study. She stopped when she saw me, then she looked at the papers I had sorted on the desk. Mom asked me to help with the filing, I told her. I was going to do that. She picked up the edge of a folder and looked at it, then set it back down. Did you look at the life insurance document? I saw there was one. It's for $250,000. She said the number the way people announce things they think you didn't know. It goes to Mom. I've already been in touch with the insurance company about what the process looks like when the time comes. That's good, I said. I continued sorting. She watched me for a moment. You seem very calm about all of this. Dad isn't gone yet? She sat down in the chair across from the desk. She had her hand at her throat in the way she did when she was working through something. I just think we need to be coordinated. As a family when the time comes. Agreed. I've all spoken to Dad's attorney. The estate is straightforward. The house, the pension, survivor benefits for Mom, the life insurance. She paused. There isn't a lot to divide. I'm not expecting anything, I told her, which was true. She studied me. There was something happening behind her eyes that I couldn't fully read. You're not curious about the will at all? I trust that Dad did what he wanted to do. She nodded slowly. Okay, she stood up, smoothed her skirt. I just want everyone to be on the same page. We're on the same page, I told her. She went to find our mother, and I sat quietly at my father's desk for a moment and thought about the conversation I had scheduled with Victor for the following week, which had nothing to do with my father's estate and everything to do with the development project's second phase timeline. Then I finished sorting the filing cabinet and helped my mother make dinner, and we ate, the three of us, at the kitchen table and talked about my father's early years and the way he used to whistle while he worked in the garage. And it was the most real evening I had spent in that house in years. And that was just the beginning. I didn't know it then, but 3 months later, everything I had built quietly, everything I had protected carefully, everything I had documented with Victor and structured with Sylvia, and kept separate from a family dynamic that had never once seen me clearly, was going to be tested in a funeral home in front of 60 people. And my brother was going to walk through the door. Father Bernard Oak was not the kind of man who pulled people aside for small reasons. He was the chaplain attached to the funeral home through a parish arrangement. A quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people needed him to be calm. I had spoken to him briefly before the service, logistics mostly, the order of the readings, whether my mother wanted a moment of prayer before the reception began. He had been gentle and efficient and completely unremarkable. So when he touched my elbow, just lightly, just enough to redirect my attention, 30 seconds after Daniel appeared in the doorway, I noticed. Because he wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking at me with an expression that said he had been waiting for this moment, and not in a good way. He guided me to a small alcove near the side door, a narrow space with a coat rack and a folding table that held extra programs nobody had taken. Behind us, the room was still reorganizing itself around Daniel's presence. I could hear my mother's voice, not words, just the sound of her. I could hear Claudia's heels on the floor. Father Oak spoke quietly, directly. I need to tell you something before this goes further, he said. Your brother came to me 3 days ago. He wanted someone to know the truth before he arrived today in case things became complicated. He wanted someone present who could speak to the facts. I looked at him. My hands were very still at my sides. He was in prison, Father Oak said. From shortly after he left until 14 months ago, San Quentin, then a facility in Fresno. He was released on parole last year. The word prison sat between us, in that narrow alcove, like something physical. He said your father never knew, the chaplain continued. Or rather, he said your father was told something different. He said someone in the family told your father that Daniel had chosen to cut contact, that he was living abroad and didn't want to be found. I heard what he was saying. I heard the shape of it before I fully understood the content. He said your father died believing Daniel had abandoned him voluntarily. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out for a moment. Who told my father that? My voice was level in a way that surprised me. Father Oak's expression shifted by about 2 degrees. He didn't say specifically. He said he wasn't certain himself. But he said the person who knew where he was, the person he had contacted during those first months, had told him it was better if the family didn't know, that it would be easier for everyone. I thought about the word everyone. I thought about who in my family would have defined everyone that way. And then the door opened, and 2 uniformed officers from the Sacramento Police Department walked into the reception room, and Father Oak and I both turned, and the alcove felt very small. I had exactly one coherent thought as I said, I need to call Victor. But first, I needed to understand what was happening in the room I was standing adjacent to, because the officers weren't coming toward me. They were moving through the crowd with a specific destination in mind. And that destination was my brother. I stepped out of the alcove. The reception room had reorganized completely in the 3 minutes I'd been gone. My mother was seated in a chair near the photograph display. One of my father's former colleagues crouched beside her with a hand on her arm. Claudia was standing with Glenn near the center of the room, and her face was doing something I had never seen it do before. It wasn't grief. It wasn't shock. It was calculation. The kind of calculation that happens when you realize a situation you thought you controlled has just changed variables. Daniel was standing near the entrance, and one of the officers was speaking to him in a low voice. Daniel's hands were open at his sides. His posture was the posture of someone who had been in that situation before and knew that stillness was the safest response. I walked toward them, not running. Walking steadily, the way you walk when you want to arrive with authority rather than panic. "Excuse me," I addressed the officer who was speaking. "I'm Nora Scott. This is my brother. Can you tell me what this is about?" The officer, a woman in her late 30s with her hair pulled back, looked at me with a professional neutrality that told me nothing. "Ma'am, we've had a report that an individual matching this man's description violated parole conditions by attending a gathering without prior authorization from his parole officer." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at me for the first time since arriving, and his eyes carried 12 years of something I didn't have a name for yet. "Is that accurate?" I asked him directly. His voice was quiet. "I filed the request. I filed it 4 weeks ago. My PO approved the exception for the funeral. I have documentation." The second officer, a younger man, was already on his phone. There was a pause that lasted approximately 45 seconds during which the room held its breath. My mother's colleague said something softly to her. Claudia hadn't moved. Her hand was at her throat. The younger officer said something to his partner. His partner looked at Daniel with a revised expression. "Do you have that documentation with you?" Daniel reached into the inside pocket of that too-wide jacket and produced a folded paper. The officer took it, reviewed it, and after another 30 seconds handed it back. "We apologize for the interruption," the first officer said. "There was a report called in. We had to respond." "Of course," I said. "Thank you for checking." They left, the door closed behind them, and the room, which had been holding itself very carefully for several minutes, let out a collective breath. I turned to look at Claudia. She was looking at the door where the officers had just exited. Her hand dropped from her throat. Then she felt my gaze, and she turned to meet it, and something passed between us in that moment that was not nothing. It was the specific look that passes between two people when they both know what just happened, and they both know that one of them is the reason for it. Someone had called the police on my brother. Someone had reported him before he even walked through the door. Someone had known he was coming to the funeral and had decided that the right response was to try to have him removed before he could say anything to anyone. I understood in that moment why Father Oak had been waiting. I walked to my brother. Up close, the gray in his hair was more visible. He had lines near his eyes that hadn't been there at 22. He looked like a version of the person I remembered that had been left in the weather for a decade. "Hey, Nora," his voice was rough. "Hey." I looked at him for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I've been worse." A small, tired smile. "A lot worse." "I know," I said, and then, because we were standing at our father's funeral and there wasn't time for everything that needed to be said, "We'll talk. Tonight, if you can, there's something I need to understand." He nodded. His eyes moved past me to where our mother was sitting, and the tired smile changed into something that had no name. He went to her. I watched her reach up and take his face in her hands the way she used to when we were small, and I felt the ache of it like a physical thing in the center of my chest. Then I turned back to Claudia. She was already moving toward the hallway, her phone in her hand. Glenn was following her. "If you're still with me, stay, because what I did in the 4 hours after my father's funeral was the reason I am telling you this story." I found a quiet corner of the funeral home parking lot and I called Victor Caldwell's cell. He answered on the third ring. I told him in 7 sentences what Father Oak had told me. I told him about the police, about Claudia's face, about what I suspected. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about him. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I finished. "I want to understand the will first, and I want to know if there's any mechanism by which someone could have managed information about my brother's whereabouts in a way that affected my father's decisions." A brief pause. "When is the will being reviewed?" "The attorney is coming to the house Friday morning. Mom arranged it. I'll be available Friday afternoon. Call me after." Another pause. "Nora, if what you're describing is accurate, this is more than a family conflict." "I know," I said. "Prepare yourself for that." I went back inside and helped my mother greet the people who were still there. And I handed out the remaining programs and made sure the coffee urns were replenished. And I watched my brother sit beside my mother for an hour and speak in low tones. And I watched Claudia move through the room with the careful brightness of someone who was managing a great deal beneath a very composed surface. And that evening, after the reception had ended and my mother had gone to bed and Daniel, and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea neither of us were really drinking, he told me everything. He told me about the conviction. Aggravated assault stemming from a fight outside a bar when he was 23, 2 months after he left Sacramento. Told me he had been terrified and ashamed and had contacted, in those first weeks, the only family member he thought he could trust who wouldn't immediately tell our parents. He had called Claudia. He told me Claudia had come to see him, that she had told him with complete certainty that telling the family would destroy them, that our father's heart wasn't strong even then, that our mother couldn't handle it, that the kindest thing Daniel could do was stay away until he had something better to say. She had visited him twice in the first year. She had told him each time that she was managing the family's understanding, that they believed he was abroad, that she was protecting everyone. He told me the visits stopped. The letters stopped. He sent a letter to our parents' address in his third year inside and never received a response. He didn't know whether Claudia had intercepted it or whether our parents had chosen not to answer. He told me he assumed the latter for his own sanity. He told me he had spent 9 years believing he had no family left. I sat across from my brother in my mother's kitchen, and I looked at his hands around the teacup, and I thought about Claudia at our father's desk 4 months ago telling me she'd been in contact with the insurance company and asking if I'd looked at the will. I thought about what Victor had said, more than a family conflict. I thought about my father in his last months, mentioning Daniel's name with that particular exhausted grief, and I thought about what it would have meant to him to know the truth. To know that his son hadn't chosen to disappear. To know that his son had been ashamed, yes, had made a terrible choice, yes, but had not abandoned him. I excused myself and went to the small bathroom off the hallway, and I stood over the sink with the water running and took 4 slow breaths. Then I went back to the table and I asked my brother whether he had documentation of Claudia's visits. He said yes. He had kept every log, every visitor record, every letter he'd sent, and every letter he'd received, as a matter of habit that the prison system encouraged. He had a file at his current address in Fresno. He could get it to me by the end of the week. I told him I would need it Friday afternoon. He looked at me with a question he didn't ask out loud. The will review is Friday morning, I said, and I think there are some things the attorney needs to know. The will reading was at 10 in the morning on Friday, at my mother's kitchen table. My father's estate attorney was a compact, precise woman named Helen Ko, who had been handling their affairs for about 15 years and who arrived with a leather portfolio and a manner that communicated clearly she had presided over more fraught family gatherings than she could count. Present were my mother, Claudia, Glenn, and me. Daniel had not been invited, which I had noted and said nothing about yet. Helen reviewed the documents in a methodical voice. The house would remain in my mother's name. The pension survivor benefit was straightforward. The life insurance benefit of $250,000 would go to my mother as named beneficiary. There was a personal property list that divided some items between Claudia and me, standard. And then there was a clause near the end that Helen delivered with the same neutral tone she had used for everything else, that made Claudia reach for her water glass. My father had left a sum of $40,000, drawn from a savings account, to be divided equally between his 3 children, Claudia, Nora, and Daniel, equal thirds. He had updated that clause 14 months ago. 14 months ago was shortly after Daniel had been released on parole. Helen looked up from the document. She looked at my mother. My mother's expression was the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming and had made peace with it. "You knew," I said to my mother, not accusing, realizing. My mother set down her own water glass. "He got a letter about 8 months before he died. It came while Claudia was visiting and she didn't see it. He showed it to me." Claudia's hand was on the table, very flat, very still. "A letter from Daniel?" I asked. My mother nodded. "From a social worker at the facility in Fresno, reaching out about family reunification before his release. Your father couldn't travel by then, but he updated the will." She paused. "He didn't tell Claudia because he wasn't sure what had happened. He wanted to understand it first. He ran out of time." Claudia's voice came out at a different register than usual, tighter, controlled in the way that control looks right before it fails. "Mom, that letter was from a stranger claiming to represent Daniel. We had no way to verify it was actually him." "Helen," I addressed the attorney. "If evidence existed that a family member had deliberately withheld information about another beneficiary's location and circumstances in a way that influenced the testator's decisions prior to the update, would that be relevant to the estate proceedings?" Helen looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of someone recalibrating the nature of the meeting they were in. "It could be, depending on the specifics. I have documentation arriving today," I told her. "Visitor logs from the correctional facility, correspondence records, covering a period of approximately 12 years. The silence that followed was 4 full seconds long. Claudia stood up, her chair scraped back. "This is not the place for this, Nora. You called the police on Daniel at Dad's funeral." I kept my voice completely even. "You reported a parole violation you knew was not a violation. I want to understand what else you thought you could manage." I was protecting this family. Her voice had gone high and strained around the edges. "I was always protecting this family. Daniel made a choice that would have destroyed Mom and Dad. I made a decision to minimize the damage. For 12 years. Yes, for 12 years, because that's what needed to happen." She looked at our mother. You know I was right, you know they couldn't have handled it. My mother looked at her oldest daughter for a long moment, then she said, very quietly, your father handled it fine when he knew. He cried for an afternoon and then he updated his will and he called a social worker to ask about visits. He handled it just fine. Claudia's mouth opened, closed. Glenn had not spoken a word. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man counting the exits. Helen gathered her portfolio with a calm efficiency that suggested she was giving us space without leaving the room. She set one document aside and slid it toward me. For your records. The estate is straightforward as written. There is no basis to contest the distribution as updated. I picked up the document. I would review it with Victor later. Then I looked at my sister. She was standing beside her pushback chair, and she looked, for the first time in my memory, like she didn't know what came next. She had run the sequence in her head, I could see it. She had expected the police to remove Daniel before he could talk. She had expected the will to reflect an older version of my father's wishes. She had expected to be the one managing the information the way she had managed it for over a decade. Every piece of that plan was gone. The visitor logs and correspondence records are going to Helen's office, I told her. Victor Caldwell, my attorney, will be in contact about what they contain. Whether that process becomes public or stays within the family depends entirely on decisions you make in the next few days. Are you threatening me? Her voice had gone very quiet. I'm describing your options, I said. The same way you described them to Daniel 22 years ago. She picked up her bag. She looked at our mother one more time, and our mother looked back, and whatever passed between them in that moment was something I chose not to analyze because it belonged to the two of them. Claudia and Glenn left without finishing their coffee. The room was quiet. Helen made a note in her portfolio. My mother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, and I turned my hand over and held on. She thought she was helping, my mother said, and her voice carried 23 years of having watched her family from the kitchen with a dish towel on her shoulder. She was wrong, but she thought she was helping. I know, I said. That's why I gave her the option. I called Victor from my car in the driveway. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the measured tone he used for serious things, that the deliberate withholding of a beneficiary's whereabouts from a testator, combined with documented interference with that beneficiary's contact attempts, could constitute tortious interference with inheritance rights, and that the false police report was a separate matter that Daniel had standing to pursue independently. He should speak with an attorney of his own, Victor said. I can recommend someone. He's on parole, he doesn't have resources. I can recommend someone who does pro bono estate and civil rights work. A pause. Nora, you did the right thing today. I know, I said. That's not actually why I'm calling. I know it isn't. Send me the documentation when it arrives. I sat in my car for another few minutes. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother moving around the table, collecting cups, the dish towel already back on her shoulder. She was a woman who processed grief through motion, through the management of small domestic things, and that was a form of strength that I had spent 20 years misreading as surrender. Daniel's file arrived by courier Friday afternoon, as promised. I sent the scanned documents to Victor and to Helen Ko by Friday evening. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not a courtroom drama. It was quieter and more methodical than that. Victor and Helen worked together on a formal accounting of the estate proceedings. Daniel retained an attorney from the nonprofit Victor had referred him to, a man named Raymond Flood who specialized in wrongful exclusion cases, and who, upon reviewing the visitor logs and 12 years of correspondence records, told Daniel he had a substantial civil claim. Claudia did not contest the will. She signed the distribution agreement, including Daniel's equal share, within 3 weeks of the Friday meeting. I believe she understood, once the documentation existed in an attorney's office, that contesting anything would make everything public. The false police report was a matter Daniel handled separately. Raymond Flood filed a complaint with the city, and after a review process that took about 2 months, Claudia received a formal citation and was required to complete a civil mediation process. It was not a criminal conviction. Raymond had explained to Daniel that pursuing criminal charges for filing a false report was possible, but would cost Daniel significantly in time and energy he didn't have. And Daniel had decided that what he needed more than justice in a courtroom was the capacity to build something. I respected that decision. Glenn filed for separation 4 months after the funeral. I don't know all the reasons. I know that two people can spend 20 years together, and the particular revelation that your spouse has been managing a family secret of that scale for 12 years can rearrange what you thought you knew about them. Claudia moved into a rental in the Roseville area. The last information I received, secondhand through my mother, was that she was working in property management for a commercial real estate firm. The irony was not lost on me, and I chose not to comment on it. My mother is still in the Sacramento house. She and Daniel talk on the phone every Sunday. He lives in Fresno, working for a contracting company that a former colleague of my father's helped connect him with, which my father would have found satisfying in a way he'd probably have expressed through a long silence and a firm handshake. Daniel and I are not close yet. 12 years is a long time, and the shape of a relationship between siblings who missed each other's entire 30s is something that has to be rebuilt from materials that no longer fit the same way. We are working on it. Slowly, honestly, without pretending we are further along than we are. The development project with Frank Gu completed its first phase in the spring following my father's funeral. My share of the return was, by any measure, something my 26-year-old self in that one-bedroom apartment in Elk Grove would not have had a category for. I reinvested most of it. I added to Lily's college fund, which is now well past the amount it held the day of the funeral. Lily is in third grade, she is thriving in her advanced program, and Dr. Singh told me at our last appointment that Lily's processing has developed so well that they'll likely reduce sessions to once a month starting in the fall. Lily celebrated this news by asking if we could get a dog. We are in negotiations. What I come back to when I think about that day in the alcove with Father Oak is not what Claudia did. It is what my father did when he found out. He cried for an afternoon. Then he updated his will and he called a social worker. He handled it fine. He handled it the way my mother had always handled things, through motion, through the management of the next necessary thing, through making space for someone to come back. Claudia believed she was the one who understood how this family worked. She had managed it for 12 years based on that belief. What she had missed was that the family she thought she was managing had more capacity for truth than she had given it credit for. I don't hate my sister. I'm not sure I can afford hate, and I'm not sure she deserves that much of my attention. What I know is that my brother sat beside my mother on a Sunday afternoon in March, and they talked for 2 hours on the phone, and that my father's name came up, and that Daniel told me later he laughed at something she said. A real laugh. The first one in a long time. That was enough. That was actually enough. So tell me honestly, because I think about this more than I expected to. Did I go too far? Or did I not go far enough? Leave me your answer in the comments.